Welcome to Profits on Purpose, the podcast for ecom and CPG founders who are looking to scale their businesses both profitably and purposefully. I'm your host, Nate Littlewood from Future Ready CFO, which is a go-to fractional CFO solution for seven-figure founders who are looking to turn financial chaos and confusion into clarity and confidence. Today's guest is Spencer Oberg, who I'm going to go out on a limb and say is probably one of the most remarkable backstories I think of any guest I've had on this show to date. At 21, Spencer was sentenced to prison, but instead of letting prison define him, he used his 8 years there to earn college degrees, deliver a TEDx talk, and launch an entrepreneurship program for incarcerated individuals called Harness Your Hustle. Upon his release, Spencer joined the founding team of Good Planet Foods, which is a plant-based cheese company he built from nothing to $22 million in revenue, and also raised about $22 million in VC capital along the way. He learned some hard lessons about over-professionalizing too early, navigating VC pressure, and the brutal reality of post-COVID headwinds in the plant-based category. After leaving Good Planet in 2024, Spencer co-founded Prospera Ventures with his wife, Bianca, and they now buy and roll up profitable food manufacturing businesses. He also serves as the CEO of Sunday Supper, which is actually how he and I originally got connected. But Sunday Supper is an amazing plant-based frozen Italian food company that's scaling incredibly rapidly from what I understand. From the wrong side of the tracks to building multiple eight-figure businesses, Spencer's journey is about second chances. It's about hard-won wisdom and the courage to keep building even when the odds are stacked against you. Spencer, my friend, welcome to the show. It is so great to have you on here.
Thank you, Nate. It's a pleasure to be.
Of course. Well, I want to get started with talking about your backstory, if that's okay. From what I understand, you spent 8 years in prison starting at the age of just 21. Can you walk us through what happened and how you made the decision to become the person you are today?
I'm happy to. I'll try to keep it to the 50,000 foot-ish view. It's a bit of a long story if we dive into the details. But if I could suffice it to say that I grew up in kind of a not so well-to-do area. We were pretty poor. I was an only child, and my dad, bless his heart, worked nights, so didn't see him much. So the guys that I looked up to as friends, role models, ultimately were making money, hustling on the side, selling drugs. And so ultimately, that's the path that I took. I managed to still kind of juggle both sides of the tracks, if you will, to mix metaphors, I guess. And, managed to get through most of school and still keep up that persona that, I was still kind of a straight-laced, good student. But on the side, I was making money, selling weed, selling drugs, starting at a pretty young age. And ultimately, fast forward to 18, 19, 20, I'd gotten hurt on a job, and one of my doctors prescribed me enough Oxycontin to essentially kill a horse. Looking back at it, it's pretty amazing how much, at least in that era, the medical profession was prescribing to folks who were injured and in pain. And because of my background hustle and stuff on the side, it didn't take me very long to figure out that I could make quite a bit of money on the extra supply that I was getting. And that ultimately blew up into a relatively large enterprise, if you will, and caught up to me. So, by the time I was after my 21st birthday, I was facing quite a few different felony charges just surrounding that lifestyle and what ultimately the underlying piece of it was selling drugs. And during like towards the end, I guess, of that little run, when I was getting relatively close to having to face the music, I had a few things happen, like getting robbed and shot at point blank. Still,
Wow.
Other than maybe there being a higher power, not sure how I didn't actually get struck by that bullet. And a few other things that really made me realize that I had a choice. I could either keep doing what I was doing and end up dead, or I already knew I was going to have to do prison time, but, end up in prison for life, maybe. Or I had to figure out a different way. So, when I ultimately got sentenced, which ended up being a 10-year sentence, I decided, I had no clue how I was going to do it, but I decided I was going to turn the next 7 to 10 years, depending on if I was, got good behavior or whatever, and turn that into a positive and build something positive out of it. And really, like, the only way that I could think of to do that is to continue my education. My grandparents had a pretty decent influence on my life, and like, he was a doctor, world-renowned doctor, and a very big proponent of education. So that was the only thing I could think of. So I decided that I was going to figure out how to get a college degree. That was really challenging, turns out, really hard to do in prison, but managed to do that and do quite a few other interesting things while I was in there. But it was really those kind of, the near-death experiences that kind of shook me a little bit, woke me up to the fact that I needed to do things differently.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of people, I guess, who found themselves in that situation would have, run the danger, I'm sure, of going off on a completely different trajectory. But you clearly managed to turn things around for yourself in a pretty big way. You mentioned the near-death experience a couple of times, but like, I understand that was kind of the catalyst, but how did you kind of decide that you wanted to go down this entrepreneurial business path? Like, how did you get to that point?
I had always kind of looked up to entrepreneurs, especially famous entrepreneurs, like I guess it was still a little bit early in the growth phase of it, but like the Facebooks, Mark Zuckerbergs, etc. And so they were always kind of like my, I guess, quote unquote heroes. I never really conceptualized myself as a business person though, or as an entrepreneur. And I think what really helped that click for me as actually, I guess there were quite a few different quite a few different encounters in particular throughout my journey in prison. But I can point to 3 that were really, really impactful. There were 3 different guys who on 3 different occasions throughout my sentence came in as part of one program or another that I was involved in to speak. The first one of them, a guy by the name of Joe, very successful local businessman here in the Seattle area, and like professor of law, CPA, just, a total badass in business, if you will. And he told us that, you guys are, first of all, you are businessmen. Think about it. If selling and hustling drugs, you've got product, you have sales, marketing, supply chain, customer service. You have to figure out your margins. Like you can take all of the things that you've been doing just kind of innately and learn how to do them legitimately. And not only that, you're kind of, entrepreneurs by necessity. Because as a business owner himself, he was like, I come in here and volunteer my time because I love you guys and I believe in you. But if I'm looking at someone who's got a criminal record on paper versus a college graduate who doesn't, it's human nature. You're at a significant disadvantage. So if you want to get out and be successful, really, you need to be an entrepreneur and you need to pursue being a business person. The second person that shared that was, and essentially, a very similar narrative, but he kind of added one piece that really helped, helped solidify for me that I wasn't so different from these guys that I was, really looking up to and idolizing. His name was Jim, and he was Fortune 500 CEO of a bunch of different companies throughout his career. And he echoed essentially the same sentiments that Joe did and said, you guys are businessmen, and you can, you can take what you know innately and learn the skills to really apply it. But not only that, you're really no different from me, right? But for the grace of God, I would have been sitting right where you are. If they would have pulled me over when I had that ounce of Coke in my trunk in college, who knows? Who knows what would have happened?
Yeah.
So that really, it started to help shift my perspective. Like, okay, maybe I can do this. And then what really solidified it is when I met David. David came in a little bit further along in my sentence, and shared his story.
This is David Israel.
David Israel. This is David Israel, who ultimately would become, would become my partner in Good Planet Foods. He came in actually as a guest of one of these other guys I was talking about, and shared his story. And his story for the company that he was running at the time was that he had written the business plan while he was serving a 4-year sentence in prison.
Wow.
He wrote the business plan, got out, made the product, raised the capital, and built what turned into an international brand and very successful snack company. And so that just really solidified, like, this dude proved it. He's done it, and I can do it too. And I kind of latched onto him a little bit as he was walking out. It's like, hey, I really want to do what you've done. Can I stay in touch with you? And he made the mistake of saying yes.
Mistake or good fortune, maybe. Depends on the perspective.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that. I'd love to understand that transition from your time in prison to getting out and getting started on Good Planet Foods with David. What was it like going out into the real world and going, straight into, running a venture-backed CPG business? Like, that's a huge change. Talk me through that transition and some of the things that you were dealing with at the time.
Yeah, it is a huge transition. And I mean, it really all started with David giving me what at the time amounted to just a job while I was in work release. I was, as part of the transition out of the Washington prison system, some guys are fortunate enough to go to basically like a halfway house or transitional, unit where you can actually go out into the community and start earning some money to try to support yourself when you're actually officially released. And because he and I had kept in touch, it so happened that he had transitioned out of the operations of Pop Gourmet, which was the snack company that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and was looking to do something else. He had apparently fallen in love with CPG and the food industry in general, but like me, he's a bit of a health nut and wanted to do something more in the better for you food space. And he, at the time I was getting out of work release, he wasn't even sure what that looked like, just that, he was going to build something new, and asked me if I was, willing to basically do whatever and, come work with them. And I said 100%. I at that point kind of idolized him and what he did, and I really just wanted to work with the guy and learn from him. So I joined and just taking a job. I remember the first task that I had was putting together a bunch of cubicles that he had brought from Pop Gourmet. You know, so I mean, it was literally bare bones startups, office cubicles.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Built a bunch of office cubicles so that we had, places for the big company that we were going to build, which we didn't end up needing those cubicles. So that's another story. I ended up having to take them down at some point too. But
such is startup
so
life.
it didn't. Right. So it didn't start out as like this an official partnership or anything like that. It was just David giving me an opportunity while I was in work release, and so I joined, and we weren't venture backed at that point. We would just, we were literally, trying to figure out what the product was going to be. David had some licensing relationships from products that he had built at Pop Gourmet that he brought with him. So some of the stuff that we did early on was working with companies like Hoi Fung Sriracha to develop other products using theirs as a base. So like Hoi Fung chocolate. I mean, he had already done the chips and the popcorn and everything. There were a few other things that we did after the fact, but we were literally just searching for that product. And at one point, his sister-in-law, who works as like a fashionista for the stars in Hollywood, said, "You really need to innovate in vegan cheese." And David wasn't vegan and loved cheese. So he's like, "Why the hell would I do that?" It's just like, no, it's terrible. There's a huge need. You need to look at it. So we did. We dove in and looked into, the market. And it just so happened that the plant-based segment of food in general was the fastest growing. And then within that, it happened to be that plant-based cheese and plant-based alternatives to dairy were the fastest growing within that category. So, one thing led to another, and that is ultimately what we chose to focus on. And that's what became Good Planet Foods. And, throughout this whole process, really, I was just executing, figuring out how to get things done, building the crazy ideas that David came up with, and including cubicles. And, along the way, he saw the value in what I brought to the partnership and offered that to me, true partnership in the company and in what ultimately became Good Planet. And so, looking back on it, he said, like, what was it like to jump into a venture-backed startup? Like, it was a whirlwind for sure. And it was fun and exhilarating. Like, I got to learn and figure new stuff out every day. And I got to do it in an environment where I could just be me and, and work with somebody that I really respected, to try to build something cool.
That's amazing.
And it just so happened that I'm lactose intolerant, so I actually resonated a lot with the product.
Okay.
Personally.
It worked out well. What a story. Amazing. I want to go back just a minute or so. You said that he saw something in you which led that to him ultimately offering you an official partnership in the business. What did he say?
That's a good question. And I don't want to put words in his mouth. But I think that he saw that he might have even seen a little bit of himself, frankly, because he saw somebody who was hungry and were really willing to work hard and do whatever it took to get things done. Somebody who is smart enough to figure things out, but at the same time also, definitely not arrogant. I had no room to be arrogant in that space because I'd never been in CPG before, right? So it was really, but honestly, I think it was a huge part of it was the work ethic and my ability to problem solve and kind of be a little bit of the yin to his yang. David's very much a visionary and networker, and he can execute and do the operations piece of it and actually put the nuts and bolts together to build things, but it's not his favorite place to operate. Candidly, I don't know that it's my favorite place either, but I have that ability too, and I did it very well. So I think he saw what ended up, and I think it was a very good and successful partnership with him. The way that he always framed it was he can go do what he does well and just trust me to handle everything, pretty much.
Sounds like a very, very solid partnership. I'd love to learn a little bit more about the journey of building the business as well. You mentioned earlier that you guys got to 22 million in revenue, I think, and you'd also raised about 22 million in VC money. Tell me a bit more about some of the highlights of the actual building process, and what were some of the biggest lessons you learned along the way?
Man, so many. So we ultimately got to that roughly 22 million in revenue in about 4 years, maybe a little under. So we were growing very quickly. And to get to that 22 million, I think we actually only raised about 12 at that stage.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So through the series, through the friends and family and angels, and then the Series A was, I believe, right around 12 million bucks, which that was a masterclass in and of itself for me. I had never raised capital before. So to, have a front row seat and to essentially help David do that and learn all about what that process looks like was, an MBA in venture finance. Absolutely. At least it feels like it. But so, early on, it was very much all hands on deck and growing very rapidly with a relatively small team. I think we were about 5 of us that got it at least very close to the 22 million mark.
5 people.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal.
Give or take. Depending on what stage we were at, there was a few more, a few less, things ebbed and flowed a little bit. So,
wow.
When I remember distinctly, I think it was actually our lead investors, I was working with some of their operating team, and they asked me, what was it like, to build something this big that quickly? And honestly, my response was, I just put my head down and worked, and next thing I knew, I looked up, and this is where we were. Because it was such a whirlwind, it really felt like that in the moment. So, early on, my wife joined us very early. She was, I don't know, number 4, I think, and helped us start, putting some systems and processes in place to support that growth. Because I think one of the things that was challenging for us, and for me in particular, I had never scaled anything to that size or that quickly. It was managing the amount of activity going on between, developing products, launching new products into retail, launching products into food service, launching retail products for our, different retail partners like Whole Foods 365, Kroger Simple Truth, Trader Joe's. Managing all these different brands in addition to our own Good Planet brand, and and trying to build that and do marketing, and actual new sales and trade shows, and there's just so many things going on that we were all kind of handling all at once. That building the systems to support those and turn it into a real business, a machine, was very challenging, and something that I think, we kind of had to take a couple of steps back and do, especially once we brought on a more seasoned CPG team, or started to build a more seasoned CPG team after our Series A. Just a good example is just a good ERP system. So the thing that you really need in order to manage all those different brands and SKUs and customers that I was mentioning, we didn't even really have something that was solid or working correctly, until we were darn near at that 20 million mark. So in the very beginning, it was a total whirlwind, and then I think there were some serious growing pains, getting some of those systems and processes really solidified and in place. And I would say that, looking back on it, for me, I'll speak for myself, but I think this probably goes for the larger part of the team because we were all relatively inexperienced in the CPG space earlier on. David had, his experience with Pop Gourmet, but he also has just been an entrepreneur his whole life. He didn't come from, the CPG space prior to that. So we were all relatively naive when it comes to the nuances of CPG. And, I think that was both a blessing and a curse. Our ignorance was good in that we didn't realize that, hey, you're not supposed to be able to do it that way. Or, you really need to go through all of these steps or have this marketing program in place for this retailer or whatever. We just attacked it head on and got it done. But it was also a little bit of a curse and kind of came back to bite us on a couple of those larger customers or larger opportunities because we didn't do the process the right way. Kroger is a perfect example that sticks out in my mind with our brand. We didn't understand all the nuances of doing business with Kroger as a brand. So I firmly believe we could have gotten national placement with Kroger with our Good Planet brand, which would have been just a massive boost for the overall multiple of the valuation of the company. But we missed that opportunity and that window of time that ultimately did become a fleeting window of time because of the macro plant-based environment, which we can touch on later. But we missed out on that because we weren't experts and didn't have, that CPG expertise to lean on. So,
just to clarify that, are you referring to the window of opportunity that Kroger would have had for pitching or receiving pitches or placements from new products? Or is there a bit more to it than that?
There's a bit more to it than that, because we were able to get the appointment and the meeting with the buyers, and David and I went and made the presentation, and they liked the product, but Kroger has, some pretty hefty expectations of brands in the way of, the brand utilizing some of Kroger's own like proprietary data insights and marketing programs. They call it like 8451 or something like that. So, in that meeting, when they asked us what our 8451 plan is, we kind of looked at each other and made a joke about Area 51, and just said, we'll do whatever marketing programs you need us to. But they weren't impressed with that. So, they ultimately chose one of our biggest competing brands, Violife, for placement on shelf as the branded placement that they were doing on that review, which their review cycles are only once a year. So we missed out on that year's placement. And then with the shift, and I think this COVID had an impact on this, and also I think there were a lot of other kind of macro factors that ultimately played into it. But, by the time we got that next review, there were already headwinds that were really coming up against the plant-based and vegan segment in the food and beverage, industry overall. And stores were already starting to kind of hold back a little bit on adding more plant-based items to their shelves because they were seeing these things aren't doing the velocities that we expected. The products aren't as good as we thought, et cetera. So there really was that window of opportunity that we had to get on shelf, and we missed out on it to Violife because we didn't know enough about what we were doing.
Yeah. Wow. That's gotta hurt. Gotta hurt. The other day when we spoke,
the lesson I won't forget.
This is true. And I think that's a great perspective to have. One of the best ways to learn is to make mistakes. And I think thinking about entrepreneurship and learning as a sequence of mistakes that you need to make so that you can learn faster is a very, very valid way to think about things. But Listen, the other day when we spoke, you mentioned that you felt you made the mistake of professionalizing or hiring professional CPG executives maybe a little bit too early, or that you over professionalized. Can you unpack that a little bit and tell me what happened?
Yeah, and I think I alluded to it a little bit just a minute ago because you know, in hindsight, I feel like there's really a good balance to have, and
Mm-hmm.
early on, before closing the Series A and ultimately bringing on some of these more tenured and seasoned food and beverage and CPG execs. I think we were too far on the side of the spectrum of not of being too startup and entrepreneurial, if that's a way to describe it, and not enough toward the professional side of the spectrum. And then after closing the round and starting to bring on the professional folks, I think we went too far to that side of the spectrum, and
Okay.
you know and it really hurt from my point of view. It really hurt the entrepreneurial spirit that had gotten us where we were. I mean, we were able to grow that quickly in that short amount of time because we were somewhat opportunistic in the things the products that we would do and the opportunities we would take on. And I think one of the is downfalls when we brought on the suits. I don't want to call them that because they're really not that bad. So they're good folks.
I know what you mean.
I'll talk a little bit more about that because it's just interesting because there's a perspective of the co-CEO that we brought on that I think kind of agrees with what I'm saying, just maybe from a slightly different point of view. But from my point of view, we became a little bit too corporate, a little bit too worried about pursuing a particular opportunity that maybe wasn't a branded Good Planet branded retail opportunity. And so that I think that really slowed our growth. And then coming into the macro plant-based headwinds that everybody in the industry faced, I mean that certainly led to revenue declines and some challenges that the company had to work through later. And so I think over skewing to that professional, if you will, side of things or corporate side of things was a big piece of it. And then I just mentioned that something that the co-CEO Bart and I actually talked about a few times, and he was the very seasoned CPG professional that we brought on, brilliant guy and very good at what he does. But he shared with me that looking back, he came in and really focused us all in on building a big organization that was posed to reach the revenue goals that we had set, in order to reach the exit goals that we had set.
Right.
And the reality of the macro environment is that we just couldn't get there by focusing solely on, the branded retail revenue. So from his point of view, he's like, I came in with this thesis and that's what we executed to. And ultimately I was wrong. And
Interesting.
I appreciate that perspective. And I think from my point of view, it was because we weren't a little bit more toward the middle of that balance between super entrepreneurial and, corporate or professional. I think if we would have struck more of that balance and been more nimble, we might have fared a little better, but
Okay.
Hindsight 2020.
I want to circle back on that, your comment about you might have fared a little bit better, but I just want to make sure I'm leading into this correctly and connecting the right dots here. So I think you said you raised 12 million, which got to you to about 22 million in revenue. But I gather there was a subsequent $10 million raised, but it didn't actually grow revenue, I presume, because it coincided with the macro slowdown post-COVID that you're talking about. So I'd love to understand what was going on inside the business when you've just taken on an additional $10 million. You've semi-professionalized the team, obviously have the objective of growing the business. What's going on internally, and what did you mean when you just said that you might have fared a bit better if the team were a little more entrepreneurial?
So to set the stage a little bit, a good chunk, I would venture to say the majority of our revenue, and don't quote me on an exact percentage, because I honestly can't pull that out of my memory bank right now, but it was the majority of our revenue that got us to that 22 million was not in Good Planet branded product. It was in private label product. So us making a version, though not as good as ours, but a version of our base formula, or plant-based cheese formulas for like the Kroger Simple Truth brand, the Whole Foods 365 brand, Trader Joe's, etc. And then there were also some other revenue streams in other what I call trade channels. So like the ingredient channel, we would sell our product to other manufacturers like Nestle, for example, to use in making pizzas or what have you.
Right.
And then we would sell it into food service, so for use in restaurants and such.
Okay.
And between those three, private label, food service, and ingredient, that made up the majority of our revenue. And when we brought on the Series A, and in order to, especially as a business that doesn't own your own manufacturing, as a CPG brand who's completely co-packed, it's very unusual to have that significant proportion of your revenue, especially coming from private label. So one of the big objectives that we were pushed pretty hard on by our lead fund was to shift the balance of the business. So shift the majority of the revenue over to branded Good Planet retail product. That way we're really building a brand that can command those kind of exit multiples once you get there, which are significantly higher than just a private label manufacturer. Because in essence, that's what we were, a good chunk of what we had built. That's what we were. So that's really where the focus shifted, and we ultimately gave up some of the private label business because it wasn't aligning with our mandate to, for lack of a better word, our objective to grow the Good Planet brand presence. It's taking up resources, and whether that even just be time and focus from the team, but it also wasn't profitable enough. As another thing where I think ignorance came back to bite me in particular, because I didn't know. We assumed that if we grow the sales quickly and we grow our volume, we can improve our margins. Sure, they're not exactly where they need to be right now, early on, but we'll be able to improve them once we, get down the road. Well, by the time we went to do that, number one, we couldn't get as much of an economy of scale as we thought we would be able to boost the margins. And it was at a time where there was a lot more competition coming into the market, and our customers, Whole Foods, etc., they had choices. When we started, we were really the only game in town with a good product, which is the reason why we were able to get all the private label business. But by the time, we really made this shift to lean heavy into the brand, there were enough options out there where we couldn't improve our margins enough. So we ended up losing that, that revenue, which was significant. So revenue definitely went down, And it's, I think it's something that both David and I have kind of said in hindsight, we would have pushed a lot harder to keep that revenue and just keep the compressed margins. And so, that's a decision in hindsight that I think, and maybe an example of kind of what I was alluding to in terms of being more balanced and entrepreneurial, pardon me. And, rather than really drawing that line in the sand and saying, if we can't get X percent revenue out of this, then we're just going to walk away from the business. But, rather being a little bit more flexible and creative on how we possibly could have, plotted the path to get there. We wouldn't have lost the 5 million in revenue or so that was associated with it.
Right. Wow. So running a private label, plant-based cheese business, you obviously understand the food manufacturing side of things very, very well. You lived firsthand what it's like to not own a brand or not own enough of a brand to be able to kind of protect yourself when things turn against you. Tell me how that experience played into what you're doing now and Prospera Ventures.
I mean, ultimately is the whole catalyst for Prospera Ventures. And I partially anyways, maybe that's the whole catalyst for our current focus of Prospera Ventures. The real catalyst was when my wife and I were, at slightly different times, but both looking at what's going to be next for us when we do transition out of the day-to-day at Good Planet, because we knew at some point that was going to be the case sooner or later, be it because we built such a great team that effectively they don't need us, and because the business isn't exploding growth like it used to, or like it used to be, there just isn't, there isn't a justification for us to be focusing on other things, really, or justification for our paychecks, or whether we sold whatever, right? So while we were trying to figure out what we were going to do next, Bianca made me promise no more startups. That we needed to figure out how to buy something that was already cash flow positive, and use all the things that we learned.
Point. Like,
yeah,
you've been doing it
I
your
know
whole
it's
life
hard
up until this point, right?
Yes, and even a couple during the same period of Good Planet. There are a few brands that David and I were involved in early on. There's a production company that ultimately grew out of, the entrepreneurship program that you mentioned that I'd started while I was in prison, that grew out of. So, yeah, I mean, definitely startup was in my DNA, and I think, honestly in hers too at that point. But it was such a grind that we were both a little burnt out and needed a break. So yeah. I was convinced. So ultimately that's how Prospera started. And when we started it, it was really starting to look at I guess the flip side of the coin, if you will. I think like I mentioned, we got a serious masterclass in what it's like to, be more on the venture side of things, or at least on, the entrepreneur, startup, operator, venture side of things. And so now, flipping and learning about what the more private equity and, acquiring something that actually makes money instead of burns money, what that means, and is actually a steeper learning curve than I expected. But one of the things that we learned pretty early on is that it's important to, as one of our mentors in the space tells us all the time, to stay in your lane. And to be candid, when we were first transitioning out of Good Planet, we were like, we want to break from food. We're not doing anything in food right now. But the more that we learned, the more that we explored the different industries, the more we realized that, number one, we were starting to miss the food aspect of it. And number two, it really had become our lane. Not only did we enjoy the industry, but like you mentioned, we learned a lot about it. And, we kind of, at this point, know it like the back of our hand. So, understanding the I guess the demographic dynamics of the owners of a lot of the co-mans that we worked with, and the fragmentation in that space, and being able to see the opportunities to, to take that business that is successful, but to take it and optimize it with our team. And then to even take, that co-man and layer in the brand part of it, so that now not only does the brand control its destiny and, has diversified revenue, but the overall organization has diversified revenue, but also that the boost in overall value from the brand. So that is where our whole, roll-up thesis came from, is all of our experiences, both working with co-mans that we sourced from and working with manufacturers that we sold to.
Yep.
And building the brand, and obviously the dichotomy that we experienced between, the branded sales versus the private label and the other sales, all of which are important, by the way. I think it's super important to have that diversified base, but. Right.
I get it. Yeah. Well, it's tight. I like the story. It's a compelling progression. There's one piece missing though. You understand entrepreneurship, you understand manufacturing, you know what happens when you don't have a brand. Let's talk about Sunday Supper and Richard Klein, because he's your branding guy, right? Tell me how that all got started. How did you guys cross paths, and how is it that you're now working with Sunday Supper?
Yeah, so Richard was actually one of my customers at Good Planet. And he was what I would consider to be like an ingredient, or I called it industrial at the time, customer. So we were selling the product to him, ultimately to his co-manufacturers, so that he could make things like, you can see him behind me, but like our lasagnas and everything, which are all plant-based. So that's how we initially met and started to build a relationship. I really enjoyed working with Richard, just, as a customer. He was certainly one of my better customers to work with, which I had some good customers, but how customers can be. So,
okay,
I had a great experience with him. Yeah. I had a great experience and early relationship with him. And when he saw basically my update on LinkedIn that I had transitioned out of the day-to-day at Good Planet and started Prospera Ventures, he reached out and said, "What is that? First of all, congratulations. What is that? What are you guys doing? Let's talk." And one thing led to the other, and he talked me into coming back into the startup world. And
what did Bianca think
becoming
of that?
a partner in Sunday Supper.
How did you sell Bianca on this idea?
It took a little bit, and honestly, I think it took a little bit to sell both of us. And what ultimately lined everything up to make sense for us, and kind of our overall strategy, is that Sunday Supper is a great brand that has a good foundation. It's definitely a startup, and in startup mode, like, we're in the process of raising a seed round, for example, right? So it's still, as of right now, it's still squarely in that venture space. But at least for us, it fit into our overall thesis of, taking a great brand and combining that with manufacturing, and not just capabilities for that brand, but the diversified, revenue streams and cash flow base that you hopefully already have if you're buying an existing co-man. And so it made a lot of sense for us. And, Richard bought into that overarching vision as part of the growth strategy for Sunday Supper and for, the bigger roll-up picture. So, ultimately, I think we've all kind of come together and aligned with the overarching vision. And that's ultimately what sold me on jumping in. And it's a fantastic brand, a great product, and it has very early promise of being quite successful. And I feel like, I certainly don't know everything. And I'm learning a ton every single day still.
Mm.
But I do feel like, some of the experiences and skill sets that I've built, that we've built, are really helpful to the brand and to Richard.
Hmm.
He's obviously a brilliant, brilliant marketer,
Yeah.
brilliant brand visionary. But he was, quite frankly, a lot like us when he dove into building this product. He came from the print marketing and magazine world. He'd built a couple of magazines, successful
Right,
magazines.
right.
So he's new to CPG. Of course, he's learned a lot over the last couple of years, but combining, I think that great branding and marketing genius, I feel, with
Hmm.
our kind of operational chops, really makes us for a solid foundation for Sunday Supper to become something big.
And it's an unbelievable product, by the way. I've actually had the pleasure of tasting it a few times at some events. But yeah, big,
Thank you.
huge fan. I want to ask you a question that I feel like you're going to have a very interesting view on. A lot of the founders that I work with are, obviously have started and are running their own businesses, and they, by default also take on the role of CEO and kind of leading or building out a team. As someone who has been a founder a couple of times, is now a CEO and has filled that seat once or twice, can you tell us a little bit about what you think the most important differences are between a founder and a CEO?
That's, I feel like, a very nuanced answer that my viewpoint on it is, I mean, maybe this is somewhat true with everything, but it's ever evolving. Right now, I think the main differences are really the main differences are like, what kind of a CEO are you? And because by default, you kind of have to act as a CEO, at least for a little while, as a
Mm-hmm.
founder.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what are your strengths? And are you good at getting something from, zero to half or one? Or are you better at taking, that vision that's gotten, sort of brought to life and taking it from
Mm.
one to five and, and so on. Um, so I think, if I had to distill it down to differences, it really is that a founder absolutely has to have that vision
Mm-hmm.
and has to be like maniacally obsessed with seeing that vision come to life. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
then the CEO really, and I used to, honestly, my vision or my perspective on a CEO has definitely evolved as, I guess, as I've gotten
Mm-hmm.
more experience myself. But I used to think that was the CEO always has to be the visionary. I think that
Right.
to a degree that's true. The CEO does need to have vision and be able to communicate that vision well, even if, quite frankly, even if the vision wasn't, theirs to begin with, even if it was the founder's original vision, they have to be able to, to align with it and communicate it well and, be infectious, I guess, to the
Yeah.
rest of the team and galvanize people in that direction. But what's more important is that they can be that leader, and then especially a little bit later stage, also a manager,
Mm-hmm.
and be much more like systems and process focused, and and more focused on the details, quite frankly,
Mm-hmm. Mm.
than the founder almost by default can't get mired down in the details. They got to have that vision and bring it to life, and then true CEO needs to be able to take that vision and and build a good team around it and make sure that all the nuts and bolts get put together,
Mm.
and that the processes that create a true business get built.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Well, Spencer, we're going to need to wrap things up pretty quickly, but before we do, where should people go if they would like to learn more about you?
Oh goodness. Well, if you would like to learn more about this wonderful company that I have the pleasure of leading now, Sunday Supper, you can go to sundaysupper.com, and I'm sure there are links there to all the socials. You can also go to our Prospera Ventures website, which is We Prospera, WeProspera.com. Also, there should be links to all the various socials there, and you can find me on the different social channels. I'm trying to be more active, and have a better presence, but probably LinkedIn is the best place. Give me a follow, Spencer Oberg. Would love to connect.
Sounds good. I will include all of those links in the show notes below for anyone who's interested. But Spencer, I had a suspicion coming into this call that we were going to have an interesting conversation, and you have not disappointed. This is one remarkable journey that you've been on. You have an absolutely fascinating life story. And, for all those founders out there who are going through hard times and think the odds are stacked against them, you are a remarkable case study and an example in how to turn your situation around and build something quite fantastic. And I just want to say thank you for coming on and sharing the story with us. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Well, take care. We'll chat again soon.
I look forward to it.